Good evening. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. We are going to continue in our new book reading, Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, with an appendix containing conversations between Abraham Lincoln and Charles Heinecke. I wanted to give you a little friendly hint, I guess, or a little, I don't know what you want to call it. I'm not really good with words. But I bought this book, Rome's Responsibility, from Abe Books. I believe it's abebooks.com. I believe, I'm not positive. But go there, and I got it for under $9. It was like $8.90 some odd cents. That's shipping and handling, tax, and everything. Seriously, it's cheap. They're used. I really highly suggest you buy books, brothers and sisters. I really do. Older books, not new books, older books, because there's so much treachery, so much lies, so much deception in the world that we live in today that they are literally changing history. And the internet is not a reliable source of the truth. It's not. Okay? So, further ado, it's part 2. Here we go. It is my purpose now to review the facts connected with the assassination of President Lincoln and the attempted assassination of Mr. Seward, and the purpose to assassinate Vice President Johnson, Secretary Stanton, and General Grant. The object of this scheme of wholesale assassinations of the civil and military heads of the government was to throw the country into a state of chaos and thus retrieve the fast-failing fortunes of the Confederacy. These facts, as developed on the trial of the Conspiracy Commission and on the trial of John H. Surratt 2 years later for a civil court, together with evidence secured by Father Heinecke and given to the world in his book, 50 Years in the Church of Rome. Hold on, I gotta make sure I'm recording here. Okay, I am. Show conclusively the hand of Rome in this stab at our nation's life. I will now proceed to pass these facts in review in their proper order and to show their significance. I do not propose to affirm or deny the charge that is now being commonly and openly made by the patriotic papers and lecturers that Rome was responsible for the assassination of our martyred president. Simply to present the facts and leave my readers to draw their conclusion from a consideration of the facts in the case. My own personal convictions will no doubt be made obvious before I get through. The very fact that the charge is being made by a high class of men and noted for intelligence, patriotism, and upright of character justifies us in making a careful scrutiny of the evidence on which it rests, that we may fairly judge whether or not it has been justly made. It is a charge of too much gravity and of too serious an import to be made lightly or on insufficient grounds. Now for the facts. And we will take as our starting point the fact well established that the headquarters of the conspiracy in Washington City was the house of a Roman Catholic family, of which Mrs. Mary E. Surratt was the head, and all of its inmates, including a number of boarders, were devoted members of the Roman Catholic Church. This house was the meeting place, the council chamber of Booth and his co-conspirators, including Mrs. Mary E. Surratt and her son, John H. Surratt, who, next to Booth, were the most active members of the conspiracy in preparation for the execution of the plot. Booth, ringleader, was born and reared a Protestant. He was only a nominal Protestant, however. He was man of the world, a drunkard and a libertine, and utterly indifferent to matters of religion. That, under the influence of associations in the conspiracy plot, he had become a pervert to Catholicism was shown, however, by the fact that, on examination of his person after his death, it was found that he was wearing a Catholic medal under his vest and over his heart. The wily Jesuit, sympathizing with him in his political views and in hope of destroying our government and establishing the Confederacy, which had already received the Pope's recognition and expressions of goodwill and sympathy conferred upon it, had been able to pervert him to Catholicism and to deceive him into the belief that his meddle would conduce to his personal safety and to the success of his enterprise. He had, no doubt, been baptized into the Catholic Church. This meddle at once marked and identified him as a pervert to Catholicism. And it does say pervert. It doesn't say convert. It says pervert. And I don't know why. I'm so sorry, guys. Forgive me. Forgive me. Maybe somebody can explain that to me. I don't know why it says pervert and not convert. All right. Now we have Mary E. Surratt, John H. Surratt, J. Wilkes Booth, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and Michael O'Laughlin, 5 of the leading active spirits in the execution of the plot to assassinate belonging to the Roman Catholic Church. My impression is that Harold and Spangler were also members or adherents to that church. Be this as it may, they together with Azertot and Payne, the mere tools and hired agents of Booth and Surratt, and so stood ready to serve their purpose. So it boots not to inquire into their faith or want of faith. Our inquiry, then, thus far has established the fact that 5 of the conspirators were members of the Roman Catholic Church and that these 5 were its leaders, to whom the execution of the plot had been confided. We have also seen that their meeting place or council chamber in Washington, while engaged in perfection, their arrangements for the assassination that had been determined upon was the dwelling place and under the control of Mary E. Surratt and John H. Surratt, her son, both of whom were zealous slaves of the Pope, clearly proven by the evidence given before the commission and by that given 2 years later on the trial of John H. Surratt in a civil court, to have been leading and active members of the conspiracy. Mrs. Surratt was a diligent and faithful attendant upon church services, and from the evidence given by 3 or 4 priests in her behalf before the commission, she had established in their estimation a high character for devotion and Christian piety. It was a noteworthy fact, however, that of all these priestly witnesses, one admitted that he had been on specially intimate terms with her during the 5 months in which the plans and preparations for the assassinations were being made. Most of them had been acquainted with her for many years and seemed to be well acquainted with her church reputation, but they had only seen her casually during these latter months. One of these, Father Wiggett, was Mrs. Surratt's pastor during all this time, and testified that he knew her well, did not know whether she was loyal or disloyal. This was seen to be very doubtful testimony, as Father Wiggett was noted for his disloyalty, and could hardly have been supposed to have spent many hours with her at different times, without ever having heard her express her views in relation to one of all-absorbing topic of the time. Was uppermost in the minds of all, and formed the chief topic of conversation. He could only say that he did not remember having heard her utter a loyal sentiment since the beginning of the rebellion, nor could he remember having heard anyone speak of her as notoriously disloyal until since her arrest. He said he had been acquainted with her through having had the care of 2 of her sons as his pupils. One of these were serving in the rebel army, and the other, John H. Surratt, had been a rebel emissary and spy for 3 years, passing back and forth between Washington and Richmond, and from Richmond to Canada and back, as a bearer of dispatches. And yet this Jesuital priest endeavored so to shape his testimony as to leave the impression that the topics of conversation between himself and Mrs. Surratt, thus all this as going on, and much more, was confined to such topics as the state of her health, weather, etc. He was very positive as to her good Christian character, which he had been summoned to prove, but had very little recollection of anything else. Father Boyle, resident at St. Peter's Church, Washington City, had made the acquaintance of Mrs. Surratt 8 or 9 years previously. He had only met her 3 or 4 times since. He had always heard her well spoken of, never had heard anything to her disadvantage, and had never heard her utter any disloyal sentiments. Father Stonestreet, pastor of St. Lisa's Church, Washington City, had made her acquaintance 20 years before, had only occasionally seen her since, had scarcely seen her at all during the last two, had always looked upon her as a proper Christian matron at the time of his acquaintance with her, which he was locating 20 years back. There was no question of her loyalty. Replying to a question by the judge advocate, he did not remember having seen her, thought he might have done so transiently since the commencement of rebellion, and knew nothing of her character for loyalty, only that he had seen in the papers. Father Lanahan, a Catholic priest living near Beantown in Maryland, testified that he had been acquainted with Mrs. Surratt for about 13 years, intimately for about 9 years, that he had been very familiar with her, staying at her house. He regarded her as a good Christian woman, highly honorable. He had frequently talked with her about current events and public affairs since the rebellion, but could not remember ever having heard her express any disloyal sentiments. Neither had he heard her reputation for loyalty spoken of. Finally, Father Young of St. Dominic's Church on 6th Street, Washington City, was called in her behalf. He had been acquainted with Mrs. Surratt about 8 or 10 years, not intimately. He had occasionally seen her and visited her, passed her house about once a month, and generally called there, staying sometimes an hour. He, like the others, was a good witness for her as to her character, but could say nothing as to her loyalty or disloyalty. He had never heard her speak as to current events one way or another. How can we credit the testimony of this witness? Is it credible that he could have spent an hour in conversation with a rebel woman of such positive character and convictions once a month during the heat of the conflict, and yet never have heard any expressions from her on the subject that filled the minds and hearts of all, formed the chief topic of conversation in all classes of society? Such silence between a rebel woman and a rebel priest who were on intimate confidential terms is too incredible to be believed. We cannot help thinking that all of these holy or unholy fathers testified under the well-understood mental reservations of the Jesuits. Father Wiggett was, as we have said, her pastor, and so we take it was her confessor. We cannot think it at all probable that she would have engaged in a conspiracy fraught with so much danger to her and such grave consequences hereafter, without having confided to him her terrible secret, nor without his approval. It certainly is rather strange that she should have broken her relationship with him after her conviction and taken Father Walter for her confessor and spiritual guide in preparation for her death. There must have been some grave reason for this change, and it was made for her by these Jesuit priests, for some important reason. It is not at all likely that at such a time and under such solemn circumstances she would have made this change from her pastor to another priest with whom she had not any previous acquaintance of her own volition. Had she been innocent, her trusted pastor would have been the one to whom she naturally would have looked for consolation. Wiggett had no doubt told her that she would incur no guilt in aiding the conspiracy, and so Walter she could declare her innocence, having the faith of a Catholic in Wiggett's power to grant her dispensation. Father Walter could say that whilst his priestly vows would not allow him to reveal the secrets of the confessional, he could say that from what there came to his knowledge he knew her to be an innocent woman. There was to be a great effort made to get a mutation or reversal of her sentence, and the strong plea of the father was to be based on this assertion of her innocence. Failing in this, Father Walter for 30 years persisted in his efforts to fix upon the government a stigma of having murdered an innocent woman. In his uniting with Father Walter in his efforts to fix upon our government the stigma of a great crime to its eternal disgrace, the Roman Catholic hierarchy assumed with him the responsibility of perverting the well-established truths of history and thus manifesting our government and their chagrin and bitter disappointment at the failure of their efforts for its overthrow. So deep and bitter was their disappointment at the signal success of the government in the vindication of its authority and its right to exist, that for a quarter of a century it never ceased its efforts to fix upon it the stigma of this alleged crime, and it was only stopped from this effort by the publication of my History of the Great Conspiracy to overthrow our government by a series of assassinations, when, fearing that its further agitation might tend to give publicity to my book, and that thus the facts of this conspiracy would become more widely known, and the truth of history vindicated, that the agitation of this charge and contention against the government was dropped as it had become a hot potato. We must not forget that in all this they acted under full knowledge of all the facts in the case. These had been fully displayed to the world through the evidence produced by the government on the trial of the assassins in 1865, and 2 years later still more fully on the trial of John H. Surratt in a civil court. These things were not done in a corner, openly before the world. Their sympathy with the conspirators and assassins and their enmity toward the government was thus openly proclaimed before the world, and the attitude of the hierarchy toward the assassination of the nation's head was clearly manifest. It was Abraham Lincoln, it is true, that was slain. It was the life of the nation the blow was aimed at. The scheme to aid rebellion by the assassination of the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, the secretary of war, and the general in command of our armies was concocted by the emissaries of the rebel government who kept their headquarters in Montreal, Canada. These emissaries held a semi-official relation to the Confederate government. The whole run of the evidence makes it clear that the Roman hierarchy kept itself in close relations with these emissaries, and it is highly probable, from a consideration of all the facts with the head of the government in those service, they were employed also. It kept itself in these close relations for a purpose, and was most likely the original source of the inspiration of the assassination plot. These rebel emissaries were Jacob Thompson of Mississippi, Clement C. Clay of Alabama, Beverly Tucker of Virginia. These had associated with them as helpers. Excuse me. George N. Sanders, Dr. Blackburn, and others, men who preferred to fight in the field of political strategy rather than on the field of battle. These agents of the rebel government entered into a contract with J. Wilkes Booth, John H. Surratt to carry out their scheme, and also aided them in the selection of their subordinates. Whether these emissaries were Protestant or Catholic, I am not informed. My impression, however, is that they were nominally Protestants. They were all, however, wicked men, evidently accepting the maximum that all is fair in war, and having no conscientious scruples as to the means that they employed to give aid to their cause. That the Jesuit had their ear and aided them with his suggestions is made probable by the fact that in his effort to enlist as a helper to Booth and Surratt a young man who was sent for the commission as a witness on the trial, Thompson used used the Jesuitical argument that to kill a tyrant was no murder, and so assuming that President Lincoln was a tyrant, it would be a glorious and praiseworthy act to take him off. That the assassination plot was known to the Bishop of Montreal, Bourget, and a number of his priests before its accomplishment and received their sanction was made plain by their subsequent conduct. As soon as the news of the assassination of the president was flashed over the wires, Fathers Bokar and Lapierre kept themselves on the lookout and ready to aid any of the conspirators who might make good their escape to Canada. John H. Surratt and a companion, whose identity was never discovered, returned to Montreal. On the early afternoon of the 18th of April, the fourth day after the assassination, the unknown conspirator then sank out of sight. Surratt was spirited away from the hotel within 15 minutes after he had registered on his return. He had registered on the same book on his return from Richmond to Canada on the 6th of April, had gone back to Washington and played his part in the conspiracy on the night of the 14th of April, and now on the afternoon of the 18th had gotten back to Montreal, and was so carefully watched for that almost at the instant of his arrival he was spirited away and kept hidden carefully in the house of Porterfield, one of Thompson's assistants, who, for his greater security, had relinquished his American citizenship and had taken the oath of allegiance to the British Crown. Porterfield told him that the detectives were on the alert and lost no time in hiding him away. Porterfield, deeply exercised for the safety of his charge, as also for his own, only kept him until he could communicate with Father Bocher, a Roman Catholic priest who lived in an out-of-the-way country parish 45 miles from Montreal. Father Bocher immediately sent his servant man to bring Surratt to his place for further hiding. Dutilly, Father Bocher's man arrived before the house of Porterfield late in the evening of the 21st of April, and taking Surratt into his carriage, drove him away under the cover of darkness, and placed him in the keeping of his master, Father Bocher, where he remained for 2 months under the most careful watch and guard of his keeper. Whilst here he was visited frequently by some of his friends in whose employ he had incurred his guilt, and by another, Father Lapierre. This Lapierre was canon to Bishop Bourket, ate at his table, and was to him the same as a hand and arm. A circumstance having occurred that made it necessary for Father Bocher to unload his charge, he sent him back to Montreal as secretly as he had taken him away from there, and placed him in the care of Father Lapierre. This father provided Surratt with an upstairs chamber in his own father's house, right under the shadow of Bishop's palace, where he kept him for 3 months, never permitting him to leave his room in the daytime, and never at night but in company with himself and in disguise. Thus was Surratt kept hidden away for 5 months in the care the charge of the Roman Catholic Church, 2 of its priests keeping watch and ward over him with full knowledge of his crime, thus making themselves accomplices after the fact, as they also no doubt were before its accomplishment. But how about Bishop Bourget? He stands behind the scenes. It is true. Was he not equally guilty? The organization of the hierarchy is a complete military despotism, of which the Pope is the ostensible. It reminds me of Pilgrim's Progress. I'm sorry. The Pope is the ostensible head, but of which the Black Pope is the real head. Yep. The Black Pope is the head of the Order of the Jesuits and is called a general. He not only has the absolute command of his own order, but directs and controls the general policy of the Church. He is the power behind the throne and is the real potential head of the hierarchy. The whole machine is under the strictest rules of military discipline. The whole thought and will of this machine to plan, purpose, and execute is found in its head. There is no independence of thought or of action in its subordinate parts. Implicit and unquestioning obedience to the orders of superiors in authority is the sworn duty of the priesthood of every grade, just as it is the duty of officers in the army, and much duty of the laity to their priests, as it is of the rank and file in an army, their immediate commanders. There is a complete chain of responsibility extending from the head all the way down to the membership. Thus, the whole vast organization can be wielded as a unit to accomplish the plans and purposes of its head. The priest is virtually an intellectual slave to his bishop, the bishop to his archbishop, and these again to the cardinals, and all finally to the popes, white and black. This being the case, it is clear that no priest would have dared to take on himself such grave responsibilities as did Father Bocart and Lapierre, involving so much danger to themselves as also to the character of their church, without the knowledge and assent of their bishop. It would have been held to be an act of insubordination, fraught with the most serious consequences to themselves. But the canon occupies a peculiar relation to his bishop, and is supposed to have no other duty to carry out the orders which he receives from his superior. In this view of the case, which represents truly the relations between Bishop Borquet and his canon Lapierre, can we rashly come to any other conclusion that Borquet was, in a moral point of view, also a member of the conspiracy? Neither would Bishop Borquet have dared to give his consent to this crime on his own independent responsibility. He knew he was acting in harmony with the desire and purpose of the hierarchy for the destruction of our government. The Jesuit plans with the utmost art and cunning, unhampered by any moral restraint, and always with the utmost secrecy, and carries out his plans in the dark. We think, however, that this case we have succeeded in tracing him through all of the devious wanderings of his dark and slimy path, and in fixing upon him the responsibility for the assassination of President Lincoln. We are not done yet. In the early part of September 1865, these unholy fathers thought it safe to unload their charge onto their brethren in England, and so made arrangements for sending Surratt across the Atlantic under an assumed name and in disguise. For this purpose, they arranged for his passage on British steamer, the Purvian, which was to sail from Quebec on the 16th of September 1865. A physician with whom Bocart was well acquainted by the name Macmillan had just gotten the position of surgeon to the vessel, and they arranged with him to take under his especial charge a man by the name of McCarthy, who, for certain reasons, wished to cross the Atlantic under assumed name and in the most secret manner. The day before the Purvian was to sail from Quebec, these two unholy fathers conveyed Surratt in a covered carriage to the steamer that was to carry passengers from the Purvian from Montreal to Quebec. They had disguised Surratt by coloring his hair, painting his face, and putting spectacles over his eyes. Father Lapierre went also in the disguise of a citizen's dress. Arriving on board the steamer, Surratt was immediately stored away in a stateroom from which he did not emerge during the voyage, Pierre remaining in his room with him. Reaching Quebec, these two unholy fathers placed their charge in the care of Dr. Macmillan and then took their final leave of him. And I'm going to end that there. Well, first let me see how long I did this. About 30 minutes. I can do one more paragraph. They had consigned him to the care of their friends in Liverpool by the hands of Dr. Macmillan, and through whose aid Surratt succeeded in placing himself under the care of the Roman Catholic Church in a foreign land. Rome is everywhere and always the same, and he can feel safe as long as he is in the custody of the Church. Here he waited for the Peruvian to make voyage to Quebec and return. He sent by the surgeon to his rebel employers in Canada a request to send him some money, but only to receive the answer that they had no money for him. The expense of sending him across the continent to Italy thus fell on the Church. His rebel friends had now forsaken him, but the Church stood by him. He was sent to Italy and was mustered into the army of the Pope, where he remained safely hidden for a year or more, but was finally discovered by a government detective who had been sent in search of him, and who went voluntarily hoping to get the offered reward, and who had enlisted the same company to which Surratt belonged. This detective informed our government of his discovery, and through the agents of our government, the Pope was informed that his soldier, who had enlisted under the name of Watson, was none other than the notorious John H. Surratt, who was a member of the conspiracy that accomplished the assassination of President Lincoln. With a shrewd show of virtuous innocence, the Pope hastened to clear his skirts and those of his underlings by ordering his arrest and rendition to our government. Rendition to our government, without waiting for its requisition. He was arrested by the Pope's authority, but was allowed to escape his guards, and thus given another chance for life and liberty. The story was that he made his escape by a bold leap over a precipice at the risk of his life. Tell this to the Marines, and old sailors will not believe it. He was finally captured at Alexandria, Egypt, and was brought home in chains, where he was held to answer for his crime. Let us here pause a moment to consider the relations of the hierarchy of this crime. Well, I gotta continue, don't I? The testimony given on the trial of John H. Surratt clearly convicts two of its priests, Bokar and Lapierre, of being accomplices in the conspiracy, and by implication as clearly convicts the Bishop of Montreal, Bishop Bourget. This testimony was spread before the world, and so must have been known to the Roman Catholic hierarchy, yet it never called any of these priests to accountability and held them responsible for this crime, the crime of the ages. No one of them was ever held to have forfeited his standing or good character in the church on account of his connection with this conspiracy, and so the hierarchy stands before the world today as having given its approval to their conduct in this matter. All right, I'm going to end that there, brothers and sisters, and that was part 2. Very cool. Interesting. I wasn't taught any of this in school. I don't know about you all, but I certainly was not. I just heard it was John Wilkes Booth, and he shot him, and boom, there it was, And that's something. Okay, there's a lot of lies going on. All right, brothers and sisters, I love you. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. Embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts and my heart, so we will not sin against God or be deceived. Take this to the Lord in prayer. Ask Him for discernment. Ask Him for wisdom. I love you all so very much. Blessed.